Hey folks, welcome back to the Learning Theater at Epic Games booth here at GDC. In this session, we're going to be taking a look at Fortnite's real-time lighting tools and techniques. So, as a quick overview, we're going to cover the challenges of lighting in Fortnite, basically the hurdles we had to overcome to make that game even possible. We'll talk about mesh distance fields, some ambient occlusion stuff. We'll talk about ray trace distance field shadows, capsule shadows on characters, and then some lighting optimization features we added to the engine by way of dynamic light culling and dynamic shadow caching, where I get to do a lot of hand puppety stuff. It'll be very exciting. So let's start by taking a look at the challenges of lighting Fortnite. So hopefully by now, one or two of you in the crowd have heard of Fortnite. It's a very bright and colorful game, and lights play a really big part in that. Now, throughout gameplay in Fortnite, there are dramatic changes in lighting. We have a time of day system always kind of going by. The storm clouds come in, everything changes at that point, and that's also handled primarily by lighting. Now, if you layer on top of that, the next point in that everything in Fortnite, or pretty much everything in Fortnite, can be destroyed and rebuilt, you end up in a situation where lights cannot be pre-calculated. There's no light baking in Fortnite. Everything must be dynamic. Now, despite that, we wanted those high-end lighting features. We wanted reliable character shadows. We wanted ambient occlusion. We also wanted volumetric lighting. And above all, it had to run well on console. So how did we manage this? Well, we added a lot of brand new features to the engine, the first of which we're going to talk about are mesh distance fields. So what is a distance field? The name actually kind of says it all. It's essentially a field that surrounds a mesh that stores a series of distances from the surface of that mesh. You have positive numbers outside and negative numbers as you go inside. Now that data is stored in a three-dimensional texture, and we pre-calculate that in the engine. We don't bother calculating it at runtime. That means it's very light on the CPU, but it does have a memory cost. It's stored essentially as texture data, so that does kind of pile up in RAM. The maximum size of a distance field is about 8 megabytes, which is 128 pixels in all three dimensions. So let's take a look at how we can turn these on in our project and what they look like. So over here in the editor, I have this tiny little snippet of Fortnite. It's kind of a little scaled down section of the game. And I'll go under the project settings. And we're going to turn on mesh distance fields, or at least I'm going to show you where to do it. They're technically already on in this project. But if we just search for mesh distance fields at the top, it's just a checkbox. If you turn this on, Unreal's going to say, hey, restart your project. And after you do that, it's going to calculate all of the mesh distance field for all of the objects that are loaded in your scene. So that'll take just a moment. We're not going to do that now because technically it's already been done. But let's see the result. So we can visualize distance fields by going under the Show menu, running down to Visualize, and just checking Mesh Distance Fields. And here's what they look like. So you can kind of see that force fieldy kind of nature of them. They sort of hover around a mesh, and they give you a pretty clean representation of a mesh. So like if we check out this car, you can tell that that's a car, but it's not perfect. As we kind of toggle back and forth, you can see how the mesh distance field represents the shape, but it's not perfect. And that's important for you to know because there's some ramifications for that in terms of lighting and memory usage. Now, understanding that, I want to talk about some of the features where we use mesh distance field, and the first of which is soft shadowing. So here inside the church, I've got this pipe organ that is already set up to use soft shadows, and as I drag this light back and forth, you can see that result. So instead of getting really sharp, really harsh dynamic shadows, particularly like look under the bench, we have these nice softened shadows with fuzzy penumbras. So let's see how we set that up. If I slide back a little bit, we have this lonely chair and a lonely spotlight illuminating it, and currently our chair is using standard dynamic shadows. Now if I go to the spotlight, I can turn on our first lighting feature, which is ray trace distance field shadows, which is a little bit of a mouthful, in case anybody wants to read that. So we'll turn that on, and notice our shadows don't look quite as good all of a sudden. They do get soft, but we lose a whole lot of detail. And why is that? Well, if we turn distance fields back on, which I've got attached to a hotkey just to make this demo a little easier, you can start to see why. That distance field has a pretty good representation of the seat of the chair, but the back of the chair is almost not there. You can kind of see a fuzzy area where it should be, but that's it. Then if you look at the shadow again, you start to see why that's important. So how do you change the quality of these distance fields? Well, you do that in the static mesh editor. So I'll just double click this mesh, open it up here in the static mesh editor, and if we scroll down in the LOD0 section, we have a distance field resolution scale property. This is literally taking the resolution of that 3D texture and just kicking up its scale to give it more data to work with. Now I want to show you the result of changing this because it's a couple of different things you need to pay attention to. On the one hand, I mentioned earlier that we store mesh distance fields as texture data, and those eat up memory. Right now, if we take a look in the viewport, and I know it's virtually impossible to read from out there, but up in the upper left corner in my static mesh editor, you can see that we're eating up 0.00 megs of data. I'm sure there's a number down there somewhere, but it's so low that we don't even really feel it. However, I can change the scale value. Let's set it up to something really ridiculous like 5. And we'll apply those changes, and now take a look at my distance field over in the scene. It's now a much cleaner representation of the chair, but if we glance back over at our memory usage, we're now using 0.21 megs just for this one distance field. So this would add up very quickly. It's not something you want to crank up really high on every single mesh in your scene. So now that we know kind of the technical ramifications of this, let's take a look at the artistic ramifications. Now, if we look at our shadow, it's got a lot more detail. I would actually argue that if you wanted soft shadowing, this is probably too much detail. We're starting to get like a little crunchiness up here at the top. So let's scale that back down. We'll pull this back down to 1 where we were so we can kind of see the difference. And maybe try kicking it up to 2. There you go. We're starting to get kind of a nice softening effect there. So the idea is that you as the artist have a lot of power over how these distance fields get used, but you also need to keep memory usage in mind and make intelligent trade-offs. Now, before we get away from distance field shadows as a feature, I want to talk briefly about lighting and levels. So distance field shadows are about 30 to 50% cheaper than standard cascaded shadow maps that we use for outdoor dynamic shadowing. The reason that's important is that if we could, we'd probably use use distance field shadows for all of our dynamic lighting outside, but they have a problem. They're completely static. They're pre-calculated earlier on in the editor, so if you have a static mesh like a tree and its leaves are blowing, that won't update in the shadow. Players might notice that the shadows themselves aren't moving. So what we do instead is at a given distance from the camera, we blend from standard cascaded shadow maps out to distance field shadows, and if you're curious, in Fortnite we do that at 4,500 units. So the player never really notices. By the time it's far enough away that you have static shadows, you don't really care about that anyway. And we saw a huge benefit to the GPU when we switched over to this. Now, the next feature I want to talk about involving distance fields is distance field ambient occlusion. And to show that off, let me fly over here to this little firehouse. Now, ambient occlusion, if you're unfamiliar with it, is how shadows tend to coalesce in corners and when objects get really close to each other. Actually, we have a white booth this year. You can kind of see it everywhere, like up inside the corners of the booth. Anywhere where two objects get close, they start to ambiently shadow one another, and that's the heart of ambient occlusion. Traditionally in our games, we pre-calculate this in light mass, because it'll do it for you, or we use screen space ambient occlusion, which is actually a post-process trick that uses normal maps. However, with distance fields, we can calculate this in real time in 3D, and it actually looks really good. Now, to set it up, if you wanted to use it in your scene, you need to first turn on distance fields. We covered that. And then you would just place a skylight into your scene and set that skylight to movable. So it's got to be a fully dynamic skylight. I'm not actually going to do that because there's already one in my scene. And to show you its settings, I get to give you a tiny little window into the development of Fortnite. All of the levels in Fortnite need to be lit precisely the same way. So as a way to save time, we take all of the important lights in a Fortnite level and we add them into the world object. So if I just go to world settings and I search for the skylight, I can scroll down a little bit and here's all of the settings for my skylight. I don't have to dig for an individual actor. Now, the most important setting that affects ambient occlusion is called max distance. So it's occlusion max distance. This is how far the algorithm reaches to decide if two objects should be shadowing one another. Now, to show you this kind of changing, let's take a look at just the ambient occlusion and nothing else. So I'll go down to show, we'll go to visualize, and we'll take a look at distance field ambient occlusion. And you can see just the result and nothing else. Now, as I increase the occlusion max distance up to, say, 1,000, you see the AO gets a whole lot darker. I'll start calling it AO. That's short for ambient occlusion. Don't let me confuse you too much. Now, 1,000 is nice. Our AO gets a lot darker. However, it's a lot more expensive. That algorithm is now having to calculate a lot more potential objects that are affecting one another. So you have to be very careful as you change this. If as an artist, what you really want is for your AO to just get darker, you have options. So let's set this, actually just to show it off, let's set it down to 100. And you can see our AO almost goes entirely away. It's because we're only looking 100 units away, and if things are farther beyond that, they can't occlude anymore. So we'll put it back at its default of 600, and let's get out of this visualization mode. There we go. And if all we want to do is darken the occlusion, we've got a couple of settings here for occlusion contrast and occlusion exponent. These take the end result we've already calculated and just make it a little darker or lighter. So we'll set contrast up to 1, and we'll take occlusion exponent, set it to like 1.2, and you'll notice the inside of the fire hall gets a whole lot darker. Now, these settings are going to be consistent throughout any objects in your scene that are occluded with distance fields. So if I come over to this apartment complex, it's now very dark and murky in here. If we go back to our default settings of 0 and 0.8 respectively, it's now brighter again. So as an artist, you have a lot of control over how this ambience occlusion gets applied in your scenes. Now, just a quick word on how we're doing this kind of under the hood. We don't actually use every single individual distance field that was calculated in order to do this. We composite them all together into a simplified distance field that we call the global distance field. And we can take a look at this too. So we can go under Show, back down to Visualize, and turn on the global distance field. So this is kind of a composited version of all those distance fields we saw earlier. We are constantly generating this as you move through the scene. New distance fields that are brought into view are added to the global distance field. Ones that you don't see anymore are rolled off. It's important to note, though, if you're playing a game where you teleport the player to a new area, you may sometimes notice a slight hitch as the global distance field has to get completely rebuilt from ground zero. Just know that that's a thing. So we use this because it's more simplified to do things like distance field ambience occlusion. It just makes the calculation faster, and for softer effects like AO, it works really well. Okay, so let's jump to a couple of caveats about distance fields in general. First off, they're for DirectX 11 up and only, so they're not going to be right for every platform out there. Also, as we've kind of already discussed, they ignore deformation. So trees that are moving or any other meshes that have vertex animation, that animation will not show up. Know that going in. Also, distance fields work best if you only scale uniformly. You actually have a little bit of wiggle room here. If you have like a tree, you want to make it a little taller in Z, you can do that. Just be careful, because if you go too far, your distance field will stretch out too much and you'll get anomalies in your distance field AO. So we try not to do that. Also, distance fields work best with smaller meshes. So if I go back over to our little firehouse and just start clicking on parts of it, you'll notice it's not one great big monolithic mesh. It's actually made up of a lot of modular parts. Now that works really well for Fortnite, where you're breaking down walls and things, but it also works really well for distance fields in general. As I turn them on, the distance fields have a lot of individual detail because of this. If this was one great big monolithic mesh for the fire station, you'd end up with just one great big fat distance field. It would be very hard to get the detail that you need. And then finally, adjust that resolution scale that we showed earlier with care, because if you go crazy with that, you can eat up a lot of your system memory. So don't go nuts with it. Okay, now, when I mention things like watch out for how much memory you're using, I feel like I'm then obligated to tell you how you can stay on top of that. So there is a command that you can pipe into the engine to have it report back how much memory your distance fields are using. And since I know we all love to look at things like logs and command outputs and things, let's have a look here. I'm going to clear out my log. Now, this command, I've got it written up here. It's really long. You'll never remember it. It's r.ao list mesh distance field. It's so long, I've already forgotten it. But there's a trick if you want to remember it. If you hit tilde to open up the console, you can type r.aol. Does anybody remember AOL? I'm going to get that joke out as many times as I can, because sooner or later, people will be like, no, what the hell is that? So if you type r.aol and you scroll down a couple of times, you'll see list mesh distance fields. So hit that, and it lists off all the distance fields in your scene. And this is already pre-sorted by how much memory they're using. So highest memory usage goes at the top. It tells you the scale setting that they were set to, and it tells you the name and path directly to the asset. So if you're running into memory problems and you know you need to scale this back, you can use this command and find the culprits real fast. All right, now a couple of other settings that we showed inadvertently, but I don't think we actually talked about. Let's go back over to our project settings, and let's search for mesh distance fields again. Now we have two checkboxes here for optimizations. We have 8-bit mesh distance fields. By default, these things are stored as 16-bit floating point texture value, so you can set this to 8-bit instead and use less memory, but it's a quality trade-off. They don't look as good at 8-bit as they do at 16, but we are using 8-bit in this case. Next, you can also compress your mesh distance fields. They're texture data, so it's very easy to compress that. The catch, though, is that if you're streaming data in and out, like level streaming, you may notice a slight hitch when you bring in new meshes that need to decompress. Okay, so up to this point, we've done a lot of talking about static objects, distance fields, things which don't move, but what about characters? So for characters in Fortnite, and I got this little Husk character here to talk about this, we use capsule shadows to help calculate our shadows. And to show you kind of what those are, we got this Husk guy who right now is using standard dynamic shadows. You can see that his shadow is highly detailed. You can see his fingers and parts of his little baseball helmet down there reflected very well in his shadow. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on capsule-based shadows. We'll just do it for the direct shadow because he's in direct sunlight. And you'll notice his shadow gets a whole lot simpler. It's actually also got a little bit of softening to it, so it's a nice soft shadow. So how do we do that? So this is set up by way of capsule shadows. If I open up this guy in Persona, I can scroll down, and we have a couple of important properties here. We have the physics asset, which you might have heard of. This is how we set up ragdolls in Unreal. You take a whole bunch of physical objects, constrain them together, and you make a ragdoll. It's all well and good. But we have a second physics asset specifically for shadows. It's the shadow physics asset. The way we use this is that we use capsules to make a rough representation of the shape of the character, and then we cast shadows from that collection of capsules and not from the character's geometry itself. This is a whole lot cheaper, and it gives us the ability to cheat and do things like soft shadowing. Now, it does have a couple of caveats. The first one is kind of obvious. If we close this back and go back to our character, obviously there's a loss of quality here. Your shadows won't be quite as sharp, but that can be a boon as well. If you have a game that's kind of overcast, this gives you immediate soft shadowing. Another caveat, though, is that sometimes these capsules get a little big, and they can penetrate through walls. If you have a character very near geometry, sometimes his capsule may pass through, and someone on the other side might actually see that shadow. So build your content accordingly. The next feature I'd like to take a look at is distance culling for dynamic lights. So if I fly back over to the church, let's come over here to this little unlit vestibule, and I'm going to bring a point light into the scene. And I'm going to give this point light a completely random, really good-looking color. Now, dynamic lights in your scene are easily the most expensive, and in some scenes in Fortnite, we have upwards of like nearly 100 dynamic lights on the scene at once, which would murder our GPU. We can't do that. So what we do instead is we have a setting on lights called max draw distance. I'm going to set this to 1,000. And now, as I back away from this light, watch what happens when we hit 1,000 units. The light just clicks off. Now that's nice. It's being completely cold. It's no longer hitting our GPU, but it's very abrupt, very obvious. It's going to freak your players out. They're going to just turn around and go like, oh my goodness, is there loot? Should I shoot something? So what we do instead is we fade those lights out over distance. We have a max distance fade range directly underneath this. We set this to 500. Now, as I scroll back, the light gently fades away until it's gone. We use this on pretty much every single dynamic light in Fortnite. So as you get far away from them, they fade away and then they're gone. And it's not jarring to the player, and we get a lot of performance back from that. So make sure if you're building dynamic situations or dynamic lighting scenarios inside of Unreal, try to put this on all of your dynamic lights because it's not on by default. Now, the next feature I want to talk about is actually really tricky for me to demonstrate in the editor because it's free and it takes place entirely under the hood. So I get to talk with my hands for a minute. If you have a dynamic light that is not moving, say like on a light post, and you have a dynamic object which is also not moving, like a building, why would you constantly cast shadows onto that dynamic object? It gets expensive after a while. We all know dynamic shadows are very pricey on a GPU. So what we do instead is we cache those shadows. The very first time we cast a shadow between two dynamic objects, we store that, and then as long as neither the light nor the object move, we just use the cache, and we don't recalculate over and over again. So in a sample scene where we have 3 shadow casting lights, performance goes from 15 milliseconds for just those 3 lights down to less than 1. You should note, though, that, well, first off, this is free. You don't have to set anything up. It just automatically works as long as your dynamic light and the dynamic object it's affecting are not moving. But also, you're going to incur full cost on that first shadow cast while you cache that up. So at that point, as long as nothing moves, you're fine. Until something changes, then it writes another cache. Next, I want to talk a little bit about fog, or I guess more specifically, I don't want to talk about fog at all. The reason for that is there's actually a session here at GDC dedicated entirely to volumetric fog and all the cool things you can do with it. It's rolling through our schedule multiple times, so swing back by, listen to Sjord. He's awesome. He'll tell you all about it. So let's review. We talked about the challenges of lighting a dynamic and brightly lit game like Fortnite. We talked about mesh distance fields. We talked about ray trace distance field shadows, distance field ambience occlusion. We took a look at capsule shadows for characters, and then we looked at some of our lighting optimizations, including dynamic light culling and dynamic shadow caching. If you like what you see and you want more information about it, all of this is already covered in our online documentation. There's a bunch of links here that you can follow. I highly recommend, if you're curious, you snap a picture of that with your smartphones. I want to thank everybody for your time while you stand there and listen to me. Please have a great rest of your GDC. If you have any questions, I'll be around the booth. Don't be shy. You all take care.